The night was unusually still when Alexander sat alone inside his dimly lit command tent, somewhere deep in the vast lands of India. Outside, his exhausted generals slept in scattered clusters, and the campfires had burned down to faint embers. Inside, the heavy scent of wine lingered in the warm air, mixing with incense and the muffled echoes of distant drums. A bronze bowl filled with water sat in front of him, reflecting a distorted image of the king who had conquered the world, but could not quiet the turmoil inside his own mind. Hours earlier, the tent had been loud with celebration. Music filled the space. Cups overflowed, and officers toasted to new victories. But as the night dragged on, the celebration dissolved into arguments, accusations, and an uneasy tension that only alcohol and old resentments can create. When the shouting ended, and when the consequences of his own anger finally settled in, Alexander found himself alone in the silence he feared most. Now, with nothing but the flicker of torchlight for company, he stared at his reflection as if trying to recognize the person looking back at him. His voice was hoarse, his hands unsteady, and the weight of the crown felt heavier than it ever had on the battlefield. For the first time in his life, the king who seemed unstoppable was forced to confront a truth he could no longer escape. The world had never truly defeated him, but his own desires began taking over. In that quiet moment, Alexander did not see a legend or a godlike conqueror. He saw a man haunted by wounds he never allowed himself to heal, a man driven forward by forces he could command on the battlefield but not within his own heart. The sins that shaped him, his pride, his thirst for validation, his need to prove himself again and again, were no longer hidden. They were sitting with him in the silence, demanding to be acknowledged. And as the torchlight danced across his face, casting long shadows behind him, one question began to rise from the depths of his thoughts, a question that would define the final chapter of his life. Had Alexander shaped his desires? Or had his desires shaped him? Whatever the answer was, these flaws had not appeared here in India. They had been growing inside him since childhood, long before he ever wore a crown. And so, to understand the downfall of the greatest conqueror in history, we must return to the beginning, back to the world that created him, the expectations that molded him, and the first spark that set his desires ablaze. To understand the desires that shaped Alexander's life, we must return to the beginning, to a childhood built not on comfort or innocence, but on expectation, prophecy, and the constant pressure to become something more than human. Alexander was born in the royal palace of Pella, yet from the moment he entered the world, he was raised less like a prince and more like a weapon being forged for greatness. Every influence around him, from the stories he heard to the people he observed, shaped a personality that was both brilliant and deeply conflicted. His father, Philip II of Macedon, was a force of nature, one of the most formidable kings of his age. Philip had unified the Macedonian tribes, built an army unmatched in discipline and innovation, and expanded his kingdom with relentless precision. In the palace halls, Alexander watched generals kneel before his father, foreign envoys offer gifts in fear and respect, and soldiers praise the king's victories. Every triumph Philip achieved cast a long shadow, and Alexander grew up believing that to be worthy of his lineage, he would have to surpass a father who seemed almost invincible. At the same time, another powerful influence pulled at him from the opposite direction. His mother, Olympias, was intensely spiritual, fiercely protective, and devoted to the idea that her son was destined for something extraordinary. She filled his early years with stories of heroic bloodlines and divine ancestry, telling him that he was descended from Achilles and that Zeus himself might have had a hand in his creation. For a young boy trying to understand his place in the world, these beliefs planted seeds of both exceptional ambition and deep internal conflict. Between Philip's expectations and Olympias's prophecies, Alexander's childhood became a battlefield of identity, one where insecurity and pride were constantly at war. He admired his father's skill and leadership, but he also resented the comparisons and the reminders that he was still just a boy in the shadow of a giant. He loved his mother's devotion, yet he sensed the weight of her belief that he was destined to rise above ordinary men. These competing pressures shaped a personality that craved validation and pushed endlessly toward greatness, even at the cost of peace. Alexander's education only intensified this inner fire. Under the guidance of tutors and philosophers, including Aristotle himself, he learned rhetoric, literature, strategy, and ethics. He devoured stories of heroes who had changed the world and internalized their journeys as models for his own. But even in these lessons, the underlying message remained the same. He was expected to rise above all others. The world was not preparing him to rule a kingdom. It was preparing him to conquer one. From an early age, Alexander trained with soldiers, hunted with warriors, and practiced the arts of combat with experienced generals. He broke the legendary horse Bucephalus when grown men could not, proving to the court and to himself that he possessed a rare combination of courage, instinct, and determination. But even victories like these did not ease the internal pressure he felt. Each success only confirmed what others expected from him, and each moment of praise reminded him that he was still far from fulfilling the destiny laid before him. By the time he entered his teenage years, Alexander had already learned to hide vulnerability behind confidence. He understood that strength earned respect and that weakness invited ridicule. He learned to control his emotions in public, even though privately he struggled with doubts he could never voice. The expectations placed on him were immense, and as he grew older, the weight of those expectations shaped his desires in ways he could not yet understand. This early environment, filled with ambition, prophecy, rivalry, and emotional tension, created the foundation for everything Alexander would become. It instilled in him a need to prove himself constantly, a hunger for recognition, and a belief that greatness was not just his destiny, but his obligation. And within this pressure, the first cracks began to form, subtle and unnoticed, but destined to grow as he stepped into adulthood. In this furnace of upbringing, the earliest of Alexander's desires took root. Desires for strength, desires for validation, desires to silence the insecurity he carried within. And from these desires, one habit emerged that would follow him for the rest of his life: wine. Nothing revealed the dark side of Alexander's drinking more clearly than the night he killed Clytus, the man who had saved his life in battle and stood beside him for years as a mentor, a friend, and one of his most loyal companions. The trouble began during a long banquet, one of those nights where the wine flowed endlessly, and emotions ran hotter than the torches along the tent walls. Alexander had been drinking heavily for hours, surrounded by his companions, musicians, and soldiers trying to keep up with the king's relentless pace. As the night deepened, so did the tension. The conversation drifted toward Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, new clothing, new rituals, and a growing belief in his own divinity. Clytus, known for his blunt honesty even in the presence of kings, finally spoke up. He criticized Alexander's behavior, mocking the idea that he should be worshipped and reminding him that his victories had been earned not by divine right, but by the sweat and blood of Macedonian soldiers. For a man already struggling with insecurity about living in his father's shadow, the words cut deeply. They weren't just an insult, they struck at the very identity Alexander was trying to forge. Fueled by wounded pride, emotional strain, and far too much wine, Alexander's temper snapped. What began as a heated argument escalated with terrifying speed. Faces flushed, voices rose, and the atmosphere in the tent shifted from celebration to dread as Alexander lunged for a spear. Before anyone could intervene, Before Clytus himself realized what was happening, Alexander thrust the weapon forward and struck him. The moment the spear pierced Clytus' chest, the tent fell into horrified silence. The king stood frozen, staring at the man who had once pulled him back from death on the battlefield, now collapsing before him because of a drunken outburst. In that instant, Alexander realized that wine had not emboldened him or made him more godlike. It had pushed him beyond reason, driving him to commit a crime against someone he deeply valued. For Alexander, this became one of the most haunting consequences of his drinking. Not the headaches, not the wild feasts, not the public scenes, but the terrible understanding that under the influence of alcohol, he was capable of destroying the very relationships that held his world together. Despite living in a world where kings collected wives and concubines as symbols of status, Alexander's desires were far more specific and far more unusual. He was not a ruler drawn to passive beauty or palace ornaments, who bowed in silence and offered nothing but obedience. Instead, Alexander was consistently attracted to women who reflected the same fire he saw in himself. Women who were fierce, proud, intelligent, and unafraid to challenge the world around them. Nothing made this clearer than his relationship with Roxana, the woman he met during his campaigns in Central Asia. Contemporary accounts describe her not simply as beautiful, but as sharp-witted, confident, and exceptionally aware of the political world she was entering. She was not intimidated by Alexander, nor did she shrink in his presence. Instead, she met his gaze with a force that caught him off guard. Their marriage was not a political arrangement, nor a gesture of conquest. It was a choice, a rare act of genuine affection in a life otherwise dominated by strategy. Roxana possessed a jealousy that matched her intensity, a trait that both intrigued and unsettled those around her. Macedonian courtiers and generals viewed her with suspicion, knowing that her influence over Alexander was powerful and immediate. Yet Alexander admired that fierceness, her ambition, and her refusal to be overshadowed by palace politics made her exactly the type of partner he found captivating. She was not merely a queen by marriage, she was a force he respected. Before Roxana, and even after, Alexander's interactions with women were shaped by this same preference for strength. His marriage to Statira, the daughter of the defeated Persian king Darius III, was undeniably political, but even she represented the kind of pride and royal bearing that Alexander admired. She was elegant, composed, and carried herself with the dignity of a woman born into an ancient dynasty. To Alexander, her presence symbolized legitimacy in the East, but it also reflected the type of inner strength he found compelling. Then there was Parysatis, another Persian noblewoman, known for her boldness and intense personality. Her reputation for defiance and independence added further proof that Alexander gravitated toward women who possessed more than beauty. Women who carried strong identities, capable of navigating the dangerous social currents of royal power. What's striking is that Alexander rarely sought out the compliant, soft-spoken women so prized by many rulers of his era. He was drawn to those who possessed qualities that mirrored his own inner fire, determination, intelligence, and a refusal to be silent observers in the games of empire. In them, he found not comfort or gentle affection, but challenge and connection, an emotional resistance that stimulated him far more than submission ever could. These relationships were not without consequences. Roxana's influence, for example, created tension within the Macedonian ranks and contributed to rivalries and jealousies inside Alexander's already complex court. But Alexander accepted these risks. He valued emotional intensity over political safety, depth over convenience, and authenticity over appearance. In the end, his taste in women reflected the deeper truths of his character. Alexander craved strength, challenge, and passion, qualities he pursued, not only on the battlefield, but in his closest relationships. And although love offered him moments of connection, it could never provide the stability he needed. The desires that shaped his affections also fueled the instability in his emotional life, driving him further into the habits that would eventually consume him. Because while love offered one kind of escape, another temptation offered him something far more immediate and dangerously powerful: the illusion that he could silence every fear, every doubt, and every wound still buried inside him. If wine began as a comfort in Alexander's life, it eventually evolved into something far more destructive, an arena where pride, insecurity, and identity collided. For most kings, drinking was a pastime. For Alexander, it became a stage on which he felt compelled to perform, again and again in front of the men who judged his strength not by his victories, but by how much he could endure without falling. In Macedonian culture, drinking was entwined with ideas of honor and masculinity. Soldiers admired leaders who could match them cup for cup, and generals were expected to demonstrate endurance in every aspect of war, including the feasts that followed it. Alexander, raised in a world where power was constantly tested, internalized this expectation from an early age. When he became king, he did not simply participate in drinking rituals, he dominated them, turning every gathering into a contest that he refused to lose. These feasts were intense, often lasting entire nights. Cups were refilled before they were empty. Musicians played loud enough to drown out rational thought, and arguments simmered beneath the false joy of celebration. Alexander used alcohol not only to relax, but to maintain an image of invincibility in front of his men. Every time he drank more than those around him, he reaffirmed his authority and reinforced the myth that he was stronger than ordinary mortals. But beneath this performance lay a darker truth. Alexander often used drinking as a way to silence the emotions he didn't know how to process. Alcohol became a way to escape the loneliness that came with leadership, to drown the relentless weight of expectation, and to mask the unresolved insecurities left by his complicated childhood. The more he succeeded, the more isolated he became. And the more isolated he felt, the more he drank. His companions, despite their loyalty, grew uneasy around these feasts. They had witnessed enough violent outbursts, enough sudden shifts in mood, to understand that once Alexander had drunk too much, even the slightest spark could ignite a fight. Officers who had faced death on the battlefield often feared these gatherings more than combat itself. They knew that one careless comment, one challenge, or one reminder of Philip could provoke an explosive reaction. These drinking marathons also shaped political decisions. After hours of heavy wine, Alexander became more impulsive, more emotional, and more willing to take risks that sober advisors would have argued against. Some of his most controversial orders, from executing long-trusted officers to planning reckless campaigns, were made during or immediately after these prolonged feasts. Alexander was aware of this pattern, yet he could not break it. Drinking was one of the few moments in which he felt human, liberated from the overwhelming expectations that came with empire. And because it offered him a brief escape, he returned to it again and again, even as the consequences grew more severe. Over time, his companions stopped trying to compete with him. They simply watched, worried, as he pushed himself further each night, driven by a need to prove something not to them, but to himself. The feasts that once strengthened bonds among soldiers slowly became reminders of a king slipping deeper into emotional exhaustion, using wine as both shield and weapon. And as Alexander continued down this path, another force, far more intimate and far more consuming, began to define the final years of his life. It was not ambition or fear or alcohol that held the deepest sway over him, but a single person whose presence could calm his spirit or ignite his jealousy in equal measure. Among all the people who crossed Alexander's path, No one held a more complex or emotionally charged place in his heart than Roxana. Their relationship did not begin with politics or calculation, but with a moment of intense fascination during the siege of the Sogdian Rock. Accounts describe how, after the fortress surrendered, Alexander saw Roxana among the hostages and was struck not just by her beauty, but by the confidence and calm she displayed in the presence of a conquering king. She carried herself with a dignity that immediately set her apart from the many noble women he had encountered during his campaigns. Their marriage was unusual for a ruler of his stature. Kings married for alliances, for power, or for stability. Alexander married only once for love. Roxana was the exception in a life otherwise shaped by strategy and ambition. Her intelligence, her independence, and her refusal to be overwhelmed by his status created a dynamic that Alexander found deeply compelling. In her presence, he did not feel like a distant emperor or divine figure. He felt seen, challenged, and understood in ways that few others could offer. But this connection came with complications. Roxana's sharp mind and strong will often clashed with the expectations of the Macedonian court. Many in Alexander's inner circle viewed her with suspicion, seeing her as an outsider who wielded too much influence over their king. Her awareness of these tensions only intensified her protectiveness toward Alexander and contributed to the jealousy for which she became known. She understood the dangerous world of royal politics, and she guarded her position fiercely. Despite the challenges, Alexander maintained a deep attachment to her. She accompanied him on long stretches of his campaigns, an unusual privilege that underscored her importance in his life. Her presence had a calming effect on him in private moments, offering a rare form of emotional refuge amid the chaos of war and leadership. When he looked at her, he saw not just a partner, but a connection to something personal, something human that existed beyond the battlefield. Roxana's influence was strongest in the final years of Alexander's life. Court gossip and political maneuvering surrounded him from every angle, but Roxana remained a constant source of loyalty. Her ambitions aligned with his vision, and her devotion made her a stabilizing force even as his emotional state grew increasingly fragile. She was at his side during triumphs, during uncertainty, and during the most vulnerable moments of his decline. In the final days of his life, when Alexander lay weakened by fever and exhaustion in Babylon, Roxana's presence became even more significant. She was among the few allowed near him, and her proximity during that period reflects not only their personal bond, but also the trust and intimacy they shared. She was the last emotional anchor in a life otherwise filled with ambition, conflict, and a relentless pursuit of greatness. Roxana represented the rare part of Alexander's world that was shaped not by conquest or political necessity, but by desire and connection. She offered him something he could not find in victory or empire: genuine affection and a sense of belonging that even he, the greatest conqueror of his age, could not create for himself. But even her love could not shield him from the next great blow that would shatter his spirit in a way no enemy ever had. Because there was one person whose loss would break Alexander entirely, shaking the foundation of everything he believed he could endure. For all the conquests, all the victories, and all the triumphs that history remembers, nothing struck Alexander more deeply than the sudden loss of Hephaestion, the one person he trusted above all others. Their relationship began in childhood, long before crowns, armies, or empires entered their lives. They grew up together, learned together, and stood side by side through battles that shaped the world. Hephaestion was not simply a friend or a general. He was the person Alexander relied on for honesty, stability, and emotional grounding, in a life where every other relationship carried some form of expectation. Their bond was often compared by ancient writers to that of Achilles and Patroclus, a comparison that Alexander embraced. Hephaestion understood him in a way no one else could. He listened without judgment, offered counsel without fear, and stood close enough to see the flaws that others ignored or concealed. In a world surrounded by flatterers, rivals, and ambitious courtiers, Hephaestion was the one voice Alexander could trust completely. But during the campaign in Ecbatana in 324 BC, Hephaestion fell suddenly ill, likely from a fever, and the decline was swift. Despite the physician's efforts, nothing could reverse his condition. When Hephaestion died, the shock reverberated through the camp, but no one felt the impact more profoundly than Alexander himself. Those who witnessed his reaction described a grief so intense that it bordered on madness. He threw himself onto Hephaestion's body, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, and refusing to accept that he had lost the one person who had always been by his side. In his rage and desperation, Alexander blamed the physicians for failing to save his companion and ordered the execution of the leading doctor. This act, driven by a combination of sorrow and emotional collapse, reflected the growing instability in his mind. He was a king accustomed to shaping the world according to his will, yet he could not prevent the death of the person who mattered most to him. The mourning that followed was unprecedented. Alexander ordered massive funerary rites, demanded that cities across the empire grieve, and even requested that Hephaestion be honored as a hero. He cut his hair, refused to bathe, and immersed himself in religious ceremonies meant to elevate Hephaestion's spirit. Some sources claim he even sought to have Hephaestion worshipped as a demigod, a request denied by the oracle but revealing just how deeply the loss had shaken him. In the months after Hephaestion's death, Alexander's behavior changed dramatically. His drinking intensified, his decisions became more erratic, and his once unbreakable resolve began to fracture. The emotional balance that Hephaestion had helped maintain was gone, leaving Alexander more vulnerable to doubt, anger, and exhaustion. Advisors noticed the shift, soldiers whispered among themselves, and even the generals closest to him grew uneasy about the king's declining state of mind. Without Hephaestion, Alexander seemed unable to find a steady path forward. Plans grew grander, more unrealistic, and more desperate, as if he were trying to outrun the grief he could not control. The man who had conquered empires with precision and discipline was now driven by emotion rather than strategy, pushing himself and his army toward goals that no longer had clear meaning. Hephaestion's death was not just the loss of a friend, it was the collapse of Alexander's emotional foundation. It stripped away the last remaining barrier between him and the overwhelming desires, ambition, pride, rage, and longing that had always lived within him. What followed next would reveal just how deeply that loss had altered him. After Hephaestion's death, something inside Alexander shifted in a way that even his closest companions could feel but could not fully understand. The conqueror who had once led with a balance of vision, charisma, and relentless drive now seemed to move with a different kind of energy, one fueled less by strategy and more by the need to fill a void that could never truly be filled. His ambitions, already enormous, expanded into something boundless and almost desperate, as if conquering the world itself might release him from the grief and emptiness consuming him. By this point in his life, Alexander had already achieved what few rulers in history could even dream of. He had defeated the Persian Empire, taken Egypt, marched across Asia, and pushed deeper into the East than any Greek leader before him. But instead of feeling satisfied, he felt the exact opposite. The more he conquered, the more he believed there was still left to claim. It was as if each new victory only sharpened the hunger inside him, driving him further and further into uncharted lands and untamed ambitions. In his final years, Alexander began planning campaigns that most of his generals considered nearly impossible. He wanted to conquer the Arabian Peninsula, expand westward toward Carthage, and push into regions ruled by powerful tribes whose lands had never been touched by Greek armies. He even envisioned naval expeditions that would encircle the entire Arabian coast, establishing a network of ports that would stretch across distant shores. Some ancient sources even suggest that he dreamed of marching toward Rome, challenging the rising power of the Mediterranean before it could challenge him. But his army was exhausted. The men who had followed him for years across deserts, mountains, and endless battlefields had reached their limit. The same soldiers who once worshipped him now pleaded with him to slow down, to let them return home, to give them a chance to see their families and rebuild their lives. Their bodies were worn down, their spirits drained, and their loyalty strained by the relentless pace of conquest. Yet Alexander could not stop. Every request for rest felt to him like a challenge to his destiny. Every hesitation from his generals felt like a reminder of his vulnerability. To stop was to acknowledge mortality, and that was something Alexander could not accept. His ambitions had grown so large that they no longer served a purpose outside of motion itself. He pushed forward not because he needed more territory, but because stopping meant confronting the emotions he kept buried beneath endless expansion. The most devastating example of this unstoppable drive came during the march through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest and most unforgiving landscapes in the ancient world. Historians still debate his reasons for choosing this route, knowing it would cost countless lives. But what is clear is that the decision came at a time when he was no longer thinking with the clarity of earlier years. The march was brutal. Soldiers collapsed under the heat, supplies ran low, and death became a constant companion. Many believed the journey served no strategic purpose and only revealed the emotional unraveling of their king. By the time Alexander reached Babylon, his body had weakened, worn down by years of hardship, grief, and overindulgence. Still, he continued to plan new campaigns, outlining strategies and naval expeditions with the same intensity he had shown in his youth. He refused to believe that his health was failing or that his life might soon come to an end. Even in the final weeks, when fever gripped him and his voice began to fade, he tried to rise from bed to continue planning conquests that would never take place. And then, at the age of just 32, Alexander's body finally gave out. His death left his generals in shock and his empire on the verge of collapse. The man who had moved with unstoppable force through 3 continents, the man who believed destiny itself bent to his will, was suddenly gone, leaving behind a vast kingdom that unraveled almost immediately. In the end, Alexander's greatest sin was not cruelty, not rage, not jealousy, and not even his appetite for wine. It was his inability to stop, his refusal to recognize the limits of his own mortality, and his belief that he had been born to exceed the boundaries placed on all other men. This belief drove him to greatness, but it also drove him to ruin, consuming him long before any enemy could. In the centuries since Alexander's death, countless historians, scholars, and storytellers have tried to understand the man behind the myth. They have charted his movements across continents, analyzed his tactics on the battlefield, and marveled at the empire he carved before reaching the age when most men are only beginning their careers. Yet despite all the victories, all the maps, and all the monuments he left behind, the true story of Alexander is not found in the size of his empire, but in the desires that shaped him as a human being. He was a conqueror who overcame every kingdom placed before him, but he struggled to conquer the battles that raged within. The wine he used to soothe his nerves became a crutch that deepened his insecurities. The rage that gave him power in combat became a weakness that cost him friendships and trust. His hunger for challenge, for love, for recognition, and for immortality drove him to heights no other king of his age could reach. Yet those same desires pushed him past the limits of what any man could endure. Alexander's greatness came with a heavy price. His ambition gave birth to an empire, but it also consumed his peace. His courage shattered armies, but it could not shield him from loss. And his dream of being remembered forever became the very thing that prevented him from ever slowing down, resting, or finding stability. He lived at a pace that no human could sustain, constantly pushing forward, constantly demanding more from himself and from the world around him, until his body finally collapsed under the weight of his relentless pursuit. When we look back at his life today, what remains is not just the story of a king who reshaped the ancient world, but the portrait of a man who was brilliant and flawed, fearless and fragile, unstoppable and deeply vulnerable. His achievements remain unmatched, but so do the personal struggles that defined his journey behind the scenes. Alexander's story reminds us that even the most powerful figures in history carry private battles that the world may never fully see. In the end, he did conquer empires. He did carve his name into history, and he did achieve the immortality he longed for. But the man behind the legend, ambitious, driven, wounded, and human, was ultimately conquered, not by an enemy, but by the desires he could never escape. He ruled the world with unmatched brilliance, yet the greatest territory he never mastered was his own heart. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring truth of Alexander the Great.